Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Stephanie Sandala. I am Programming and Outreach Specialist here at LibraryLink NJ. I'm so thrilled to introduce this program on creating a gender-inclusive library and how you can better serve your patrons and your staff. I'm thrilled to introduce Dr. Travis Wagner. Dr. Wagner is a lecturer at the University of Maryland College of Information Studies, as well as an instructor at the University of South Carolina's Women's and Gender Studies Department. Their primary research interests include critical information studies, queer archives, and social advocacy in librarianship. Wagner is also the co-creator of the Queer COLA Oral History and Digital Archives Project. Dr. Wagner, thank you for being here. We're so happy to have you.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. I will go ahead and I think share my screen now, and then we'll get started. I'm going to do the obligatory ask if people can see that before I go into presentation mode. Cool. Awesome. Thank you to LibraryLink New Jersey for having me, and Stephanie in particular for reaching out and having me. A caveat ahead of time, Stephanie knows this, that I'm coming off of the end of a really gnarly cold. So if I just mute and go blank for a second, it's probably because I'm coughing and not because I stopped talking. I just want to give you a heads up just in case that happens at any point. But with that being said, I'm here to talk to you today about creating a gender inclusive library. So in order to do that, I think it's important that we start by maybe confronting some normative presumptions that we hold related to gender identity, expand outward and think about the social role of ideas like cisnormativity in our daily lives. If that's a term you're not familiar with, we'll work on some definitions in a few slides, but we'll sort of think about this wedged within larger assumptions of normativity in society, and think about this question of allyship, advocacy, relational to what is happening in queer or LGBTQ plus communities by highlighting what they're already doing to create inclusive, resource-rich spaces for themselves. And I'll talk a bit more about why I think that distinction is really important here. And then we'll spend some time really looking at the barriers preventing LGBTQI plus communities from engaging with libraries, with the caveat that we're really thinking here about gender identity. But I'm happy to field questions that may be more broadly about these questions, because as we'll see, it's hard to pull them apart. And what I'll do after we sort of talk about these barriers is really consider it within librarianship broadly. I gauged from the discussion we we're having before that we're getting librarians from a myriad of different sub sort of library types, right? It sounds like a bit of public, a bit of academic. The school folks, I think, are still at school, but might roll in as well, or see this later. So I want to be cognizant of them. And what I want to do in the sort of conclusion of this is sort of find methods and tools available to you as information professionals to aid in queer inclusive information work. But know that a lot of you are here to think about things like information access, questions of intellectual freedom. And I'd be remiss not to acknowledge that I think a lot of our minds are on book bans and trying to stop some of these materials from being in libraries. I have thoughts and advice about that, but my hope is that that portion of conversation can be much more a dialogue on methods and tools we're respectively using, because there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer to that particular thing. So a bit more about me. You heard a little bit, but I always like to give a bit more context of where I come to this work from. I have a history degree. I think a lot of people with a bachelor's in history degree. I went on to get an MLIS at the University of South Carolina, where I also pursued a graduate certificate in women's gender studies. I went on then to get my PhD at the University of South Carolina as well in information science. And now, as you heard, serve as a lecturer at the University of Maryland's College of Information Studies, where I'm also the associate director for the Center for Archival Futures. I think it's important that you know that I identify as genderqueer. I use they, them pronouns. And I like to call myself a reformed media studies scholar, because I started doing very academic media analysis and then realized I was more interested in questions of identity and archiving, and particularly this intersection of queer activism and queer community archives, which led to the work that I'm doing. Here's a picture of me from like pre-pandemic times, giving a tour of the Columbia Museum of Art on gender in their art collections, just so you can see me in not Zoom mode. I do want to provide a few notes on terminology before we're moving forward. You might have heard me use the term queer a few times and maybe been like, oh, I'm not supposed to use that term, or I thought that was a bad term. Certainly context historically where that's the case, but I'm using it here to understand that gender and sexuality within this sort of larger umbrella of LGBTQI plus identities often it's really hard to separate gender from sexuality, and understanding these identities often overlap. Therefore, queer becomes a shorthand or a term to sort of collectively represent that. But it's also a theoretical and sort of political practice of queering things, right? Sort of confronting the normative assumptions that we have embedded into the things that we think about and engage with in our day-to-day life, and thinking about who is represented in those normative presumptions, and particularly when they create binaries. One thing we might think about a lot in our field is like good versus bad information. How do we create that idea, and who is and isn't considered in that conversation, right? We might think of non-authoritative, authoritative resources in the same way. So it's really sort of thinking about, well, what do we mean when we say those things, and who is represented? That is a sort of queer lens that we can put to this. I also want to give us a couple of other terms to work with here as well. Heads up on the next slide, apologies for like uncanny valley generative AI, but the term I want us to think about is heteronormativity. So heteronormativity is this idea that everyone in the world is heterosexual. They are attracted to somebody of the opposite sex of them. And by design, the world represents and reflects that identity. So when I go to DALL-E and get generative photos of engagement photos, you might observe that they read a bit heteronormative. We might also observe that they read and skew towards whiteness as well, remembering that these sort of larger normative ideologies are intersectional as well. And again, this happens because the representations we have, the corpus that these AIs are being trained on, are these identities and these images. So we have that term. We also have something like cisnormativity, which we want to think about, which is the idea that everyone is cisgender, that their gender identity matches their sex assigned at birth, and in turn, that the world represents and centers cisnormative identity. So when I go to, in my defense, in the defense of ChatGPT, this is a purposefully insightful question here, given what it is, right? But when I ask ChatGPT how to throw a gender reveal party, right, it is assuming sort of two cisgender identities, and then also conflating these sort of essential understandings of what these identities look like. So these are terms that are impacting and informing what we're going to talk about today. So I wanted to have those at the onset of our discussion. And your question following this is like, okay, cool, we saw some ChatGPT, but how does cisnormativity impact our daily lives? In a lot of ways, right? Cisnormativity exists within government documents, legal documents, medical records, the structures of schools, how marketing campaigns occur, the media we consume, how we get on dating apps, how political ads are framed, all of our mythology, information and communication technologies, and of course, and I hate to say it, libraries as well, right? I think we want to believe that libraries are inclusive spaces. In many ways, they are more inclusive than some spaces, right? But it's equally the case that if your library is exclusive of gender identities, much in this delightful sort of riff on the Arthur Library Card song, it's difficult to imagine folks having fun in those spaces. And the other thing that I want to set up here, right, is I'm going to talk to you about some practices and how you might center community needs and what communities are doing. But this is not novel information that I'm providing with you. So I'm going to do my best to sort of highlight ways that you can dive deeper into particular questions and look towards folks who are also doing really important work. And two people I'd be remiss not to mention here are Heath Fogg Davis, who has written this really amazing bit of scholarship on legal policy and particularly how it impacts trans identities. So he does a lot of analysis of how you think intentionally about describing trans identities, what policies reproduce cisnormative identities and exclude trans populations as a result. So I'd really encourage you to check that out. And we're going to come back to it a little bit later when we're thinking about policy planning. But I'd also be remiss not to mention Stephen Kruger's amazing Supporting Trans People in Libraries, which is a really sort of necessary referential point on how to have some workable best practices on supporting not only our trans staff, making visible and clear how you're supporting trans communities in your library. So I'd encourage you to sort of check those out if you're looking for more information after this talk. The other thing I want to think about is everyone in here is coming to the space with some degree of insider or outsider status. Many of you may be part of the queer community. Many of you may even be trans, non-binary, or fall under that broader umbrella. And some of you may not. That's fine. We're thinking about sort of how our embodied identities inform what we see and do. So I'm trying to make what we talk about as open to anybody who is an insider, outsider. But even if you are part of the community, your status as an information professional might cause you to have a particular perception with the community, even if you are a member of that community, right? And understanding why that might occur is going to be really important. So what my hope here is that I can get you to be the best version of an advocate for this work, regardless of where you're coming from. And I think we've probably seen iterations of this sort of map of a bunch of alliterative ways of thinking about that relationship, right? We can start at the apathetic, which is you do not care and do not know about the issues that are facing non-binary, trans, queer folks. And that's where you stop, right? But you could also be an actor in it where you're, sort of aware of things, but you just don't care or don't do anything to challenge yourself or think about that, right? Then we get to the step of ally, which you're aware of these issues and sort of do work to acknowledge that, maybe at an individual level. Whereas then you shift to this idea of advocate, where you're actively going out and working to address these things, and accomplice being the sort of inverse of apathetic and really sort of addressing and trying to deconstruct and undo some of these systematic inequalities that we'll talk about. So I would like to sort of say that if you're here today, you're probably at least at the middle of things, right? You're trying to think about ally, you're probably also an advocate. And my hoping is we can make you better advocates and even accomplices by the end of today. No promises, but that's sort of the hopeful version of this. So what are some ways that you can move past being a passive ally to an active accomplice? I'd be remiss not to tell you that the basics are important, right? Making sure that you're getting pronouns right, sharing pronouns, the sort of work that I think many of you probably already came here knowing and doing. Having visible gender neutral bathrooms when possible is really important here. And just making sure you are up to date as the best of your ability with correct terminology, talking about these things. Again, I don't want to sort of overexhaust this talk by highlighting what the contemporary terms are, but I'm happy to direct resources that are sort of adapting and evolving to that. But then you can step up those basics, right? So you can think, well, I've learned to sort of incorporate pronouns. I'm thinking about terminology. How can I start removing gendered language from my practices? When am I assuming or naming gender identity in my day-to-day talks, right? When could I be saying parent instead of mother, father, when I don't have that information right? These types of things, expanding your gender inclusive language, and then allowing terminology to shift, right? I think one thing I often hear people get frustrated with is, I don't know the right term to do or to use, and it keeps changing. That's going to be part of this, right? It's accepting that it's adapting, and the folks who are defining those identities are also trying to figure this out, right? So if it's frustrating for you as an outsider, it's equally disorienting and frustrating for the person trying to figure it out, right? So being helpful and not frustrated by this, I think, is an important next step. And then we can move these conversations about demanding basics from others, right? Correcting the cisnormative practices of those around you. You might be really good at not misgendering somebody, but you could have a colleague, a friend, family member who isn't, and your job is to now sort of use your position to call attention to that. And then if we get really sort of broad with this, it's really decentering cisnormative thinking in your daily life. And I just always like to ask people as a reflective question, how often do you presume the gender of a person you've never interacted with? And I don't really want to sort of ask you to answer that question right now, but really think about when you see somebody, do you automatically ascribe gender, and what are the impulses and desires for doing so? And I think that will really get you to step back and think, well, what is my relationship to this, and what's the value that I see in doing it? And what I want to do is call attention to impacts that I've identified with collaborators and scholars in my own work in spaces that, again, we think of as doing this work. So in 2020, I co-authored a piece with a colleague who is a translinguist we sort of explored the limitations of certain degrees of inclusivity in academic librarianships. So it's really great to have those sort of basic elements where we have gender neutral bathrooms. Practitioners are signaling or sharing their pronouns, having diverse book displays, yet there seem to still be issues with getting trans folks to step into and use libraries. And we sort of found is there are all these structural issues that are still reproducing and pushing out or excluding trans and non-binary folks in library spaces. We'll talk about those a bit more, but they tend to be tied to things like the way books are organized and shelved relational to other books, how databases talk about identity, things that you're probably really keen to, but maybe haven't thought about engaging in quality control because you assumed or maybe thought that sort of covering it in these other visible ways made the library space inherently void of these other problems. So really thinking about how as an institution are there still normative presumptions that we need to challenge? And this was a piece that sort of explored that. And again, we'll talk about it a bit more later in the presentation. But what I want to tell you here at this point is that gender inclusive work is not merely about adapting to the identities and frameworks of trans and non-binary folks around you. It is also about reflecting on how your worldview might still implicitly exclude trans and non-binary persons. And again, we'll think about this throughout this talk and happy to have a conversation about it in the back end of our time together. What I also want to say here is that queer communities do not need saving. I think that's a really important thing for us to think about. And what we want to think about is that through finding and using information, I think we often think that we're saving folks, and that's not the case. Instead, what this community needs is space, time, and resources to extend the radical work that they are already doing. And again, this is something I want to highlight and make important here. And it's what I'm going to spend a good bit of time talking about for the next portion of this presentation, because I think it's going to really ask you to think about what your provision is and how you make your spaces inclusive. And again, not trying to tell you that I've invented something new, but I'm building off of the work of folks who've been studying queer communities, trans non-binary communities, and how they have combated misperceptions or assumptions about their own deficits, right? Kate McKinney's written a really wonderful book about information activism from the lens of media history, showing how what we think of as these like silent, non-communicative communities have actually been advocating for one another. McKinney has this really wonderful chapter about lesbian call lines and the sort of communicative support that was happening between the folks there that just wasn't visible. So we did not think it was existing, but when you recontextualize those conversations, you see amazing advocacy work. On the other end of things, we have something like Mary Gray's Out in the Country, where she really dives into looking at how present and very real LGBTQ youth are in rural America, but we don't believe that that's true because we've painted a picture of what rural America looks like, and it's one that is deeply anti-queer, yet she went and studied rural Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Arkansas, and revealed there are quite a few youth vibrantly thriving in these spaces, right? So it's about as much as us challenging where we do and do not think folks exist and how they have and have not been thriving. And this leads us to this question of how they're engaging with and doing information. We're going to have a few slides and talks about information practices. So folks who went to an MLIS program that was really theory heavy, this might trigger you to think about some of that. It might not be your ideal return to that, but I want us again to think about what resource creation, information creation looks like from a community landscape, and particularly in the context of queer communities. So we have to start first by understanding this idea of information poverty, this idea that there are groups of people who just don't have information and need to be given that information. And we want to reframe that concept, right? Because of two things. What it doesn't do is sort of understand that those perceived deficits are actually informed by barriers, institutional or social, that make it difficult for folks to use and engage with information. But it's also a question of, these communities, as we're sort of hopefully starting to see, engage and share information with one another, but they're in very productive community ways, understanding that there might be external forces that would cause harm should that information get leak outside the community, or might be misused once outside of the community. And this is important because, as we see for queer populations, their systemic biases are rooted in heteronormativity and homophobia and transphobia and cisnormativity. Transnormativity is also a thing, probably beyond the scope of this talk, though. And what we're seeing further is that these communities, particularly if they're queer and trans, are utilizing both physical and virtual spaces to challenge these barriers, right? So if just to sort of speak plainly about it, if you're not seeing trans youth showing up at your library, it's not because they don't exist. They might be going to online spaces, some of which I'll talk about, because they're finding an economy of support there that just isn't present elsewhere. So this then asks us to think about, well, how are these communities seeking, sharing, using, and creating information, and what might we learn from those processes, and how might we adapt librarianship in response to that? So one example we see is information seeking, and one example I always like to talk about is this phenomena of T4T that happens in dating and social spaces, where trans individuals will go into a space and use a set of sort of hashtags and language to sort of identify that I'm interested in looking for other people who are trans as well. So the seeking has this caveat of shared language that you sort of adapt and learn that says I'm specifically looking for these identities. Certainly not a phenomenon unique to trans communities, but it's particularly utilized to sort of say, hey, here's who I am, and I want somebody who has this shared, even if we understand trans to be a broad category, that they identify as this, or perhaps non-binary as well. We also see sharing of information and perceived gaps to that knowledge. As you sort of heard, I do a lot of work in queer archives and particularly queer activism, and there's a sort of perception that there just isn't queer history in archival records. There's tons of it. It just potentially needs to be reconstituted and evaluated through queer lenses. So you'll see tons of both professional and amateur queer historians sort of take individuals from history and say, if we think about this through the lenses we have today, doesn't this person look an awful lot like a figure who we call transgender? An example of this I really like to highlight is the Rainbow History Project on TikTok, which I don't know if you came to this talk expecting somebody to hype TikTok, but it's a phenomenal channel led by Rudy and a couple of other folks who really do work to give voice and image to queer history that, again, I think we've historically been told doesn't exist. So this is a really wonderful example in my mind of information sharing. We might also think about information use, right? And we'll get into this a bit more in a more detailed example around health information, but it's incredibly difficult to get access to gender affirming care in the United States, even in states that are incredibly supportive of this. It's due to things like lack of support in health insurance, barriers and rules on who is and isn't allowed to do that. You need to go through psychiatric approval to get that, going through legal approval, and then also accruing the funds to do so, knowing that all of those things have economic costs to them. So you'll see the utilization of things like GoFundMe as an information resource to sort of say, I'm using this to sort of seek out support for these varieties of care. And I think that's a really important thing for us to highlight. And I'd be remiss not to talk about one of my favorite examples of this, which is information creation. Sometimes in the world, there aren't representations for your community, and you need to quite literally go out and create something in absence of it. So I have some colleagues, particularly folks like Diana Flogel, who look at how things like fan fiction are actually really innovative spaces for identity making, where you can lay to claim identities that you're still trying to figure out in the quote unquote real world. Or you can say, well, this piece of media wasn't written this way. It is very much about this. And my favorite example here is from a Tumblr post about Mulan being a trans narrative if you read it in particular ways. And I encourage you, if you haven't watched Mulan in a few years, go revisit it with that in mind. And it's a really fascinating Disney movie in those contexts. But what do these look like more broadly? Well, as I mentioned, I wanted to sort of give you a way of how I've thought about it in my work through the lenses of health information. So this is a project that I had the great fortune of working on with Dr. Vanessa Kitsey at the University of South Carolina. And this is a subset of research that we did looking at the health information practices of LGBTQ folks in the state of South Carolina. This particular piece looking at how trans and non-binary individuals sort of utilize various information communication technologies to respond to trans exclusionary healthcare systems and some of the cisnormative issues that we've been talking about so far. And what I want to do here is sort of pause and differentiate between something being trans exclusive and being transphobic. Transphobic, as I'm sure you know, is a deliberate vitriolic attack against a person because of this identity. Something being trans exclusive is, by its design, it's not including this. It wasn't necessarily meant in a malicious way, but it excludes this community as a result of it. So if we take healthcare spaces as a site of study, we can think of the doctor's office, right? I can't imagine any of us are particularly keen on going to the doctor's office, but if you do, it tends to be a process of repeating information, engaging with people who do and do not know why you're in that space. So as a trans non-binary person, if you go to a doctor, you're already sort of ready to have to combat the ways in which you might be misgendered, dead named, seen as an identity other than the one you have, even at an affirming doctor, right? Because there's somebody working the check-in desk, there are nurses you're gonna have to interact with, and if they're not all on the same page, you're constantly having to face that, right? So there's this struggle that's often identified in the community of how to find a doctor who's affirming, but a healthcare space that's affirming. And even when those spaces are discovered, things happen, right? So theoretically, let's say a pandemic happens and it causes a lot of healthcare practitioners to close down, or the healthcare practitioner moves elsewhere, that individual in that community has to then go through this process again. And if you've gone to a new doctor, you've gone through that, you know, you often have to update your patient intake forms. And this is an example of a patient intake form you might notice that has some things that might be trans exclusionary, sort of the way it talks about first name, last name, the lack of discussion around pronouns, preferred name, the conflation of sex and gender, right? These are documents that you then fill out. And you're once again facing trans exclusionary technologies. And this form is going to then move through that system and reproduce itself, right? So again, it's these iterations of frustration that I think are really important to think about. So what this has led to then is a focused need on thinking about trans-specific medicine. And that is a twofold process, right? We can't deny that there's an increased lucrative tie by the field in general to study trans medicine because there's money to be made in it, right? But I'm talking about a trans medicine that is led by the sort of community needs and an emergence of trans and non-binary folks who are getting into medicine to address some of these issues. And just to sort of give you an example of how this happens, just in a sort of community sense, many folks bind their chests for a variety of reasons, right? To alleviate dysphoria, to help with flattening their chest until they can get affirming surgery. But binders are not the cheapest thing on earth. So sometimes folks will use things like ACE wrap to bind instead, which can be incredibly dangerous. It can cause sort of damage to your chest. It can cause damage to your bones, lungs, things like that if it's too tight. So what will happen in response is communities will gather together healthcare resources for individuals who need a binder, provide this material resource as an act of health care, right? For the ways that it not only stops the individual from doing a dangerous binding practice, but also helps with the sort of psychological and emotional well-being, combating things like dysphoria. So we see these acts of care in really important ways. But we also see it again a lot in that seeking, sharing, using, and creating landscape, right? So you'll often see that because of the anonymity afforded on social media, sites like Reddit, folks will go out there to ask for friendly doctors near them, right? We would like to say that they might go to the library, but there's something different about going to this informational space because, again, you can seek out context without having to necessarily identify yourself. But you can also see these really radical acts of information sharing. So you'll have tons of folks who, after they go through gender affirming surgery, will write a zine, a post, an informational document about that. with the heaviest context that it's a unique experience, they'll still say, hey, these are things that I was able to do. Here's how I got my practitioner to affirm it. Here's how I got my healthcare provider to care about it, my insurance provider. Here's what I said to my psychiatrist to get these, right? Like these hidden pieces of information that help expedite the process, but aren't always transparent when you're going through it. So you'll get these really rich information sharing practices. You also see really radical information use where trans, non-binary, and queer communities in general will create informational spaces where they'll say, oh, we know that there's this trans affirming doctor who is willing to provide information. So we are going to get our organization together. We'll have a private Facebook event where we can bring as many folks who want to ask questions to this doctor to this space, and it will be sort of informational and sharing, and we can ask things that we might not ask of a non-affirming doctor or might not ask in a public space, right? So you can see the utilization of even a Facebook group, which might seem antithetical to innovative use, but in really radical ways here. And again, creation is really important as well. Here, oftentimes, what we saw in our study was that communities would create lists of affirming doctors, but we're concerned that if they make those lists public, individuals who wanted to be on that list who weren't affirming but wanted to get money from trans patients would put themselves on those lists, or even worse, particularly in states like South Carolina, individuals who want to do reparative or conversion therapy would put their names on that list, right? As sort of saying, oh, we're part of this, right? So it was this community vetted resource that was a password protected shared document that nobody could alter or mediate, and trans folks had control over who was and was not allowed to be on that list, right? So it was community vetted and an informational resource that was shared, right? And I think this word of mouth nature is a really important thing for us to think about. So that was a lot of information that you're like, well, this health information, what does that have to do with librarianship? I'm hoping that, well, I hope that's maybe more obvious than I need to make it, but also I'm hoping that we can shift to sort of broadly thinking about information resources in this community centered way. But it tells us that queer and trans folks exist in a system that explicitly and implicitly excludes them. And this is, and in spite of this, they produce robust health informational practices that affirm and protect their communities. There are also ways that can help us to rethink how we design the way that users engage with information systems at an individual and systematic level. And also ask us to reframe how we understand authority and value with regards to information. I mentioned TikTok earlier, right? It might just seem as anathema for us to say that there might be informational value in there, but I think there might be, and I think we have to be honest about that. And then you can also accept that information sometimes exists outside of the view of information professionals, right? These have protective functions. They are about building trust and word of mouth engagements. There are certainly information professionals who have been able to sort of become insiders in that space, but it didn't happen overnight. And I'll talk about methods and approaches at the end that you can take to maybe become that type of insider. And practitioners are more likely to need training than queer or trans persons. So you can use your positions of power and privilege, and I mean that in the context of being an information professional, to have dialogues with folks to sort of say, hey, how are we thinking about our resource provision to the community, to trans folks, and how can we change that, right? How can we have policies about that work? I'll drink some water quick. And this is a quote from the piece that we published together that I mentioned earlier. And it's that solutions are informed by findings that elicit complex sociocultural and socio-technical phenomena produced by the ever-changing relationships between these elements. This observation means that there are no quick fixes or shortcuts to developing trans and gender non-binary inclusive healthcare systems and technologies, but rather these must be produced by sustained efforts to understand and respond to both sociocultural and socio-technical barriers. So then what does this look like for librarianship? Well, we can think about broad LIS practices to begin with, right? First off, we have to step back from this idea that there is something that we have that trans and non-binary, trans and queer folks are lacking. That's not the case, right? What we have to think as well is about embedding gender inclusive work into our organization's missions. I think the reality here is that we also have to think about diversifying your staff to include queer and trans voices, so we can sort of maybe navigate some of these questions insider and outsider, but also highlight when these normative presumptions show up. We have to think about targeting structural problems at a local level. I'm talking to you about how this is broadly impacting the field, but how can you think about it in your day-to-day interactions with patrons, with staff? I really like Emily Drabinski's idea about teaching the radical catalog. The idea that if you're facing some sort of inequity or representation issue, you can have a conversation with you and a patron to say, well, like, how did we get to this point? Like, what is happening and how can we undo it moving forward? And again, I want to be clear, and this includes what I'm talking to you about today, right? There is not an easy fix to any of this. So I'm not giving you one size fits all solutions, nor would I tell you to trust anybody who gives you one size fits all solutions to these problems. I'm imagining that Jersey has a variety of different sized institutions, community needs, geographic representation, and you're going to have to adapt accordingly. And it's always important to remember that you're combating a broader social challenge, and information professionals are not the only ones facing this, right? What I'm talking to you about is a thing that everyone's grappling with, right? It just happens to impact LIS professionals in unique and unfortunately quite visible ways right now. So some things you can think about that might be happening, and this reflects back to the piece on academic librarianship that I mentioned earlier, right, is where are your books showing up on literal shelves, right? Due to the way that information organization systems have been designed, oftentimes your books about trans identity tend to be, unfortunately, very close to books about sexual deviance and paraphilia, really borrowing from the work of Melissa Adler here. So if you're this identity, you go into a library, you go to your bookshelf, and you're being shown that you're the same thing as this problematic behavior, right? Again, this has to do not just with how information organization is built, but also how psychology is developed, right? It was not only until very recently that in the DSM, both gay identity and trans identities were seen as disorders, right? And I think understanding this is really important. And this was a library in 2019, as you can see in the southeastern United States. But again, I want to highlight that despite of this, there are some really amazing communal responses to trans exclusion. So I've talked to students at universities who have built their own Google spreadsheets where it's like, oh, here are all of the trans memoirs in our library. Here are their call numbers. Here's how you do a holds request. That way they just come directly to you. And I worked with the students to sort of help create this. That way they didn't have to literally go into the library to do this, right? That doesn't necessarily solve practitioner practice, but I just want to show that people are still using it, but it might not be in as straightforward or traditional ways as we're used to. But you can remember that there are inclusive alternatives, right? If you can't upend your cataloging system, which is a very reasonable and understandable thing, right? It's a difficult process to do, and is again more structural to the field. You can don't sleep on a cautionary warnings, right? This you can say, we understand that some of this terminology is outdated. We're working on it. We would love to have a dialogue about this, right? So maybe don't literally put caution tape up on these, but you could have sort of caveats. You can also look at things like the homosaurus, which are linked vocabularies that help fill in some of these blanks that say, here are ideal terms. We can add these on top of it as we're still fixing some of these descriptive challenges. But again, it's not just about physical books and where they show up. Trans exclusion can also happen in databases and descriptions. Here's an example of a piece I wrote in sort of summary that actually does a good job, but what you often see is that there'll be these bios and summaries of texts that unnecessarily gender or dead name authors. And this can be really alienating, again, to users because they're seeing, oh, well, if the library catalog can't get it right, then what value can I expect the other resources to have? And again, that's not indicative of any particular practitioner. It has to do with, labor and resources, the value we see in copy cataloging, the continued push towards sort of machine-generated cataloging as well. But it also happens in how we describe resources themselves, particularly visual information. I always use this example from my days as a cataloger in a moving image research collection where we had this really amazing set of newsreels that had what can only be described as gender non-conforming representations, yet the content descriptions tended to sort of over-rely on gender description in spaces where it wasn't necessary. And at the time, this has since been fixed, utilized subject headings that were less than ideal, but outright offensive. And I marked one of them out because it was truly one that you're like, oh, I didn't know people didn't know better than to not put that. You can probably guess what it is. And again, seeing that in spite of this, right, that communities are responding to and building histories together. An example I always use is Joe Carstairs. They were this really eccentric speedboat racer in Britain who is represented all over historical archives. But because of a history that's been written about them that refused to acknowledge that in Carstairs' diaries, they said that they did not identify as a woman, they're often sort of read as this butch lesbian, and that's the only identity we can have. And in response to that, a lot of again, amateur and online historians have sort of said, well, look, we have these sort of trans figures. So we see a recontextualization happening regardless of whether or not the resources are properly represented by communities. So a couple of sort of notes here to think about when deploying gender inclusive language. You can think about the values of things like the author versus gendered pronoun, using the author's last name in place of pronouns. You can describe the paper book information item rather than its creator. If you're thinking about visual information and you're describing it, you can do it based on the person. You can just talk about gendered ways of being without naming a gender, right? So if we go back to that image I showed you, this person is in a tuxedo, this person is in a bridal gown, right? That help sort of give you language that isn't a gender that you don't necessarily have affirmation for. If you're looking for a place to prioritize where misgendering might happen, you might look around the trans study stuff. Obviously not the only place that trans people exist, right? But that might be a place to sort of say, hey, if we're having the issue here, we might be having it elsewhere. And I think just giving space to evaluation, right? I can't tell you how many times, excuse me, I've been able to get libraries to change by just, if they had a feedback button, I'd say, hey, the term you're using here is outdated. Have you thought about changing it? And oftentimes the person sends a really wonderful response and says, I'd love sort of to have a conversation about how we can build this. You know, we're short staffed, so thank you for catching this, right? Really a wonderful space for collaboration. And I know a lot of communities are really interested in helping do a better job with this. But it's also about the resources themselves and what we see as the ideal or provided resource. So I want to call your attention to what we think the needed resources are. I've been at ALA sort of meetings with folks building these, and they'll be like, well, we have databases about LGBTQ studies, so we have trans resources, right? And I'll really push back on them because I'll say, sure, but they're like medical studies about trans people that are often reproducing problematic relationships between like violence and HIV and AIDS. And trans folks maybe want different resources, right? They might want coming out resources or transition resources, and they want things that are more localized. So thinking about sort of scoping for that, it can be really important. And I think that's true for public and academic libraries as well. Obviously a little trickier on a case-by-case basis for school libraries, given the legal trends around when you are and are not allowed to talk about that with youth. Again, knowing that there are community responses to this, right? There's a history. So if I tell you that like Reddit is a space where trans folks are building this information, it might seem a bit disconcerting, but there's a history of this practice, right? There's newsletter sharing that's happened between trans communities. This is an example of crosstalk, really popular from the 70s to the 90s, but there are examples much earlier and examples between Reddit now and physical communication with them. So when you're thinking about gathering resources, right, you might look outside of the traditional academic or authoritative resources to elsewhere. I'd be remiss not to say trans student educational resources isn't like the gold standard for this work. They tend to have the most up-to-date terminology, the most accessible and usable resources, and tend to have, excuse me, training resources as well. You might look at Garden State Equality. That's as local as I was sort of scoping things for you, but I'm sure at even more local levels, particularly if you're in more urban areas or the capital of Jersey, right? Like there tend to be also local contexts as well. We mentioned sort of the value of zines and individual information sharing. You might gather zines, you might build resources and say, what are the communities in New Jersey building? How can we sort of share and highlight those in the process as well? But there's also this question of exclusion. And I just sort of like to tell a story here about when we were conducting that health information research I told you about earlier. We went to a library in South Carolina, very clear that we were doing this queer focused research. And the sort of director said, oh, wonderful, we'll have you. Everyone's going to be excited that you're here. You're welcome to do interviews with community members here. And we started conducting an interview about this in one of their spaces. And some of the staff started hovering around, right, giving the sort of implication that we weren't necessarily welcome there. And it led to this very clear reminder that not everyone in a space is on the same page about what gender inclusion looks like or what queer inclusion looks like. And making sure that that translates across the board is really important. It's worth noting that the same library was also the site of a debate over drag queen story time that led to sort of really politicized debates around that. And it leads to that question of sort of how you can embed and deliberately make clear that you are allowed to have queer and inclusive materials in your library. And one thing I would say is that, look at what community responses to these questions are. Stephanie was telling me at the onset of this, so I want to give a space to talk about it, that there's a lot of back and forth about book bans in New Jersey, but New Jersey is a state that has sort of pretty explicit gender discrimination laws, which is fortunate. So you can really lean on that. If somebody sort of pushes back about having these resources, you can sort of say that we can't explicitly prohibit gender identity discrimination. And that argument, and I'm, again, knowing that I'm not a legal scholar, that does give you the sort of out to say, well, we have a precedent for doing it at the very least, right? So exploring that's important. But again, want to give space to what folks are doing on the ground here, obviously. And if you're thinking about, more broadly creating trans-inclusive policies, I can't express this enough. Sometimes it's just a matter of explicitly stating every gender identity that you can. This can be exhausting, but if you list them out, it gives every window to sort of say, we include these identities in our non-discriminatory clauses, right? That way there's not like, oh, well, you said women, and that didn't include X, Y, or Z, right? You said trans women, trans men, so we can discriminate against somebody who's gender queer, non-binary, right? You might also think about your sort of policies and their relationships to requiring government IDs, avoiding relying on gender markers. I know for a lot of reasons you need documentation to give out library cards, for example, but it goes without saying, but like, don't look at the card and be like, oh, well, you don't look like the person on this, you can't have it, right? And I think that's a really important thing to think about. And then, to the example I gave earlier, have explicit discussions around gender diversity and employee onboarding. That way there's no confusion by any staff member, top to bottom, on who is supported and who is included in this space. And then finally, the sort of question is, what if you want to do something now? Well, my advice is always to help address material realities and needs within the community. You can think about how you can help with collaborative resource sharing, not resource provision, right? And that means to say that hopefully I've shown you that these communities are doing some really innovative shared information work, but there's a need for stable, sustainable reference points for community resources, right? Stable web links, storage space online, something that some libraries can and cannot provide, but this is a really important space, right? Can you translate things into, say, a library guide for your community? But also remember that you have in-kind services you can provide, right? I can't emphasize enough how many times we talk to communities and they're like, we just need somebody to help us fill out a grant, right? And I'm not talking about an IMLS grant, which with all of its weird hurdles, we're talking like sort of funding for housing support type things from trans activists, trans and national organizations, right? I think just having the sort of skill set there, but also getting through paywalls and utilizing databases, something that many of you are probably very familiar with doing. There's also questions of sort of volunteering, right? And this is non-LIS related and LIS related. First, you can sort of say, hey, I'm going to go to sort of help with this clothing swap, clothing donation drive that has nothing to do with me being a librarian, nothing to do with me being an information professional, but helping the community. And that's how you can sort of start building connections and networking. And then you can say, oh, well, I noticed while I was here that you have a room that looks like it's supposed to be a library, but it's a bit disorganized. How can I help you sort of organize this, create a catalog for it? That way you can update and access and use things in a more meaningful way. And there's just the reality of space-based needs, which I think, again, public libraries are probably in the best position to do is just provide space for the community to meet up and organize together. And again, if you're in a position where you can do this, monetary donations don't hurt. And as an act of good faith, I will be donating a portion of my honorarium for this talk to the Transgender Awareness Alliance in South Carolina. Incredibly important to me in my time when I was in South Carolina, and always sort of want to pay it forward to the work that they're continuing to do, some of which is highlighted broadly today. With that being said, I would love to stop. Thank you for your time. Open it up for questions. Here's my email address. And if you want to, again, yell at me on Twitter, there's my Twitter handle as well. And I'll stop sharing and look forward to a brief chat we can have.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I appreciated all the resources and information. I did see a few questions in the chat, and if anyone else has some as we go along, feel free to put a question in the chat, or you can even unmute yourself and ask. It's really informal. I know someone asked earlier about what to do if you don't have gender neutral bathrooms and you want to advocate for them in your library.
So that's a tough question. My immediate response would be you surely have a staff bathroom or an equivalent of that could serve as a mediary. You maybe have an accessible bathroom that can serve as a mediary, which isn't a long-term solution, because the problem there then is that you're like literally being like, okay, well, you're different, so go to this different space, right? But in terms of like an immediate solving that problem, right, you could have something that says, upon request, we have a gender neutral bathroom, right? That might be the quickest way to solve it. You could then, if you're thinking about more broadly advocating for it, that's where you do conflate it into like questions of universal design. So you'll see this as a solution. Again, it's not ideal. I'm not wild about it, but you'll see all of the other types of bathroom needs conflated into one, right? So it's the accessible bathroom, it's the family bathroom, it's the gender neutral bathroom, right? You might be able to, for lack of a better word, sneak it in as a solution, right? Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. I think that was really helpful. And let us know if that answers your question as well. I know there's another question earlier, kind of like more of a thought process of, you're talking about building community earlier, and I know Nicholas had asked, it's kind of like how bookstores kind of filled in the gap, and public libraries couldn't necessarily, or didn't want to fill the need, or weren't able to fill the need for the trans community.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I hadn't really thought about it a lot, but the queer bookstore, like the sort of anarchist bookstore, is this like really niche space that I think we have to have honest conversations about where we see queer bookstores, right? They tend to be in very Jack Halberstam has this phrase of like metronormative spaces, right? So they tend to be in like San Francisco, Asheville, probably Trenton, right? Like I'm trying, where's a big New Jersey place? Where there's a economic support for that, right? So it tends to skew towards a particular type of queer population, and in which case, this is where your sort of branch libraries, your suburbs, your stuff can say, oh, well, maybe I'm going to go take a quick trip to the queer bookstore and see what they have, and then see if I can't slightly adapt my collection development plan in response to this, right? So I think they're a mediary, but they are tied to particular sort of geographic and class and probably race-based identities. So you can say that it has a function, but it doesn't fill a larger gap. The other thing I would say, and I didn't mention this, is that like a majority of the LGBTQ population in the United States lives in the American South, right? Which is, I think, maybe a surprising bit of information to us. And that tends to not be a thing that we associate as having tons of queer bookstores, save for your Asheville's, your Atlantas, right? So again, yes, but it's so in some ways libraries don't fail in this capacity. They fill in a gap that a less urban space can't afford to have, right?
Yes, that's a great answer too. There's also a really, really good question in the chat. It said, as a trans person, they find themselves often expecting to teach information professionals about their experience. And, this is an emotional barrier, as I'm sure you're well aware too. And, how would you recommend the library staff go about getting ahead of that concern for patrons? And how should library staff go about that in general, not to overwhelm their staff or their patrons, expecting them to teach them about this experience?
Yeah, I think that's from Ruben, right? Yeah, you're not the only one. It's and I can't explain it except it's like a daily thing, right? Where someone is like, oh, I've decided, I realized because I said this thing in front of you that it might be problematic. So now I'm going to exhaust my guilt onto you, right? So there's not an immediate way to alleviate that. My thought would be, and I give this with a caveat that like it causes you to be read as standoffish or unwilling to help, but you can sort of say, hey, listen, I can't do this labor for you. Here are resources to read. If they don't illuminate any of the questions you have, maybe you can still have that conversation, right? But like you can hit them with the like, you're an information professional, you know how to look. I mean, like I say it all the time. I was like, you have X, Y, or Z degree. Theoretically, right? That might not. I should caveat that might not be the case for all of your colleagues, right? Because that's not MLS is not something everyone has access to. But like in some capacity, you can do that work. But I think that goes to having to have a conversation at a policy level more broadly, where it's like you have to at some point start intentionally onboarding folks to have that conversation. That way it's not a react like, oh, I didn't know, nobody's ever talked about this before. You must explain it to me, right? If it's an informational policy thing, that changes things a bit. And that doesn't give you an ideal answer, but it gives you a couple of different ways to, I hope, displace that labor. But I just want to say I hear you and it's real and it happens even in non-professional context, right?
Yes, that was really helpful too. And I know it's such an emotional burden. So thank you for
Oh,
sharing.
yeah, no, it's, and I want to highlight Melania's point. That's just wonderful about like, menstrual products can go in any bathroom, right? There are lots of ways in which like nobody, if you don't tell anyone, you just sort of put them there and nobody's going to say anything, right? And yeah, so it's just a great point.
Yes. I also see Jen has a good question about how do we navigate advocating for trans folks in our community and ourselves as trans librarians. It's a community we work in isn't necessarily safe. I know that is the case for some of us in New Jersey Library, so that is a really good question.
Yeah, the only thing I can tell you here is, and it's not you have to just be so careful and for lack of words, gentle with how you work with trans youth, right? Because they're going to want that visibility, but they may not have the scope to understand the impact of that visibility, right? And I'm speaking from having seen this happen in South Carolina, right? Where suddenly people were coming out of the woodwork to spout transphobic stuff. So you can say, hey, I would love to support this book club. Can we find a way to talk about what it is without explicitly stating it? And you can be honest with them and you'd be like, that backlash will come from this, right? Is there a way for us to talk and do this without calling it this thing, right? And this is where I would lean on like folks who are in school libraries, right? Like you can call a GSA a lot of things that isn't a Gay Student Alliance, right? And if you know, right? And it tends to get off the radar of folks unless something becomes public, right? So it might just be a slow moving process and might not be advertised on your website, but you can sort of think about those steps. And again, doesn't solve the reality that people want to harm them, as you rightly observe, but it gives a way to make it less clear on how they could find a way to do that, right?
Great, thank you. And Karina, I see your question. We actually are planning a follow-up specifically about cataloging, with like subject headings. So yeah, Travis, if you have a device, that'd be great, but I am planning a follow-up webinar specifically on that subject.
No, the only follow-up I have is like, I gave you LGBTQ specific examples of this, right? It is not unique to them. I have colleagues who are doing this for indigenous populations. You might imagine there's a lot of questions about repatriation and identity and who's naming is important there. So I would love to hear about that when it happens, because I might show up as well. And my thought was here for that, my advice is more, where are the non-subject heading parts that you can fix, right? Subject headings can be a little tricky to undo, but there's a lot of descriptive space notes fields that you can do some counter description or additive link data would be my only immediate advice, right? And then please, you have my email address. Please feel free to reach out if we didn't have time to answer your question or you, for understandable reasons, didn't want to ask it, right?
Yes, definitely feel free to reach out. If you have any questions, I know some questions are sensitive, so feel free to email, reach out to Dr. Wagner, reach out to me, I can pass it along. We're happy to help.
Cool.
So thank you so much again for being here. You've been wonderful. This is a great presentation and the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. We're
Awesome.
so happy to have you.
Yeah, wonderful questions. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, thanks again.
Cool.